There are experiences that don't end when they end. They don't stay in the past the way we expect them to. Instead, they dissolve into something quieter, something that begins to shape how you see everything that comes after. Not as a memory you revisit, but as a shift in perception you can't fully undo, and what feels like loss at first slowly reveals something deeper beneath it. Not just about the person who left, or the connection that changed, but about the version of you that remained when everything familiar started to fall apart. Because in the aftermath of emotional disruption, the real story is never only about what was taken from you. It is about what was quietly built inside you while you were still trying to make sense of it. I want to begin by saying something I rarely state this plainly, because the way this subject is framed demands a level of honesty that softer wording would only weaken. What I'm about to describe is not poetic justice in the easy, comforting sense where someone causes harm and then receives a neatly balanced consequence that restores moral order. Life does not operate with that kind of symmetry or narrative fairness. What I'm referring to is something far more complex and far more real. It is the internal psychological reality that unfolds within a person, specifically within an avoidant individual, when they betray someone whose emotional depth, integrity, and capacity for genuine love had become central to their life in ways they themselves often never consciously acknowledged. Even when their behavior appeared disconnected, even when they acted as if it didn't matter. And when I use the word *betrayal*, I want to be precise about what that includes. I am not only referring to obvious ruptures, the clear, undeniable breaking points that everyone would immediately recognize as betrayal. I am also referring to the quieter, more subtle forms that are just as impactful in their emotional consequences. The withdrawal at the exact moment presence was needed most. The silence when clarity or reassurance was required. The pattern of coming close enough to create emotional safety, then stepping back just enough to destabilize it again. The cycle of warmth followed by distance, of connection followed by sudden absence, and the experience of allowing someone to invest deeply in you while you consistently withhold the level of reciprocity that depth requires. These patterns are betrayals, even if they are not consciously registered as such by the person enacting them. That lack of recognition is not a minor detail, it is actually central to understanding the entire dynamic, because on the receiving end, they are experienced fully as betrayal. Not abstractly, but physically, emotionally, psychologically. They shape the nervous system, the attachment system, and the person's sense of emotional reality. And over time, they set in motion consequences for the avoidant that unfold slowly, quietly, and with a depth that is often far more significant than any immediate consequence could ever be. The first thing that has to be understood is why the avoidant did not realize this at the time. This is not a side detail, it is the foundation of everything that follows. The avoidant did not understand that what they were doing would have lasting consequences because they fundamentally misread the nature of what they had access to, not through conscious dismissal and not through intentional devaluation, but through a perceptual distortion built into avoidant attachment itself. A distortion that consistently minimizes the importance of connection while it is present, and simultaneously exaggerates the ease with which it can be replaced or lived without. One of the deepest ironies of avoidant psychology is that the same protective system designed to shield them from emotional overwhelm also prevents them from fully perceiving what is actually meaningful in real time. The mechanisms that create distance from loss also create distance from appreciation. In trying to reduce pain, the system also reduces clarity, so the avoidant moves through something rare, something emotionally significant, something genuinely irreplaceable, without fully registering its value while it is still available. Not because they are incapable of understanding value, but because their internal system is actively filtering out the emotional data that would make the cost of loss fully visible. Practically, this means that many of the choices they make, the distancing, the inconsistency, the emotional withholding, are made without a clear understanding of what is truly at stake. They are interacting with something they believe is flexible, recoverable, or indefinitely forgiving, something they assume can withstand neglect without breaking, but it is not flexible. And it is not endlessly recoverable, it is rare, and in many cases irreplaceable. The reckoning does not usually begin at the moment of betrayal itself, it begins later, sometimes much later. And this delay is crucial because it determines the exact psychological shape of what follows. In the immediate aftermath, after withdrawal, after separation, after emotional damage has already been done, the avoidant's internal defenses are typically operating at full strength. The system does what it was designed to do. It manages emotional overload by suppressing it, compartmentalizing it, and reshaping it into something less threatening to the internal self-structure. From the outside, this can look like detachment. It can look like emotional neutrality. It can look like the absence of consequence. And for the person who was on the receiving end, it can be devastating to witness, because it appears as if the connection meant very little, or perhaps nothing at all. But as discussed in previous work under *Avoidant decoded *, that interpretation misses the actual mechanism entirely. What looks like indifference is not the absence of feeling. It is the active maintenance of containment. It is psychological effort, continuous, consuming, and often unconscious, being used to prevent the full emotional reality of the situation from surfacing all at once. It is not that the avoidant is unaffected, it is that they are not yet able to safely be affected. Because if the full weight of what was lost or what was done were to fully register at that stage, it would destabilize the very structures they are relying on to remain emotionally functional. The reckoning comes later. It begins when suppression is no longer fully effective, and when reality begins to re-enter experience in ways that can no longer be cleanly filtered out. And almost always, the trigger is the same. It is confrontation with something undeniable, the lived evidence of what is no longer there. Sometimes that arrives in the simple, quiet form of your absence. Not the dramatic absence of fresh loss, but the settled, irreversible absence of someone who has genuinely moved on, someone who has taken the emotional energy once directed toward the avoidant and redirected it entirely back into their own life, with a completeness and self-possession that no longer leaves any trace of waiting. When the avoidant encounters that kind of absence, something subtle but irreversible begins to shift. The internal system that had been treating the loss as temporary is suddenly confronted with proof that it is not. That the door they always assumed remained theoretically open has, without announcement or drama, become something else entirely. Not a door anymore, but a sealed threshold, a closed chapter, a life that is now self-contained, self-directed, and moving forward with its own momentum without any structural space left for the idea of their return. At other times, the encounter is even more direct. It is a version of you that appears in some context, through some channel, that is unmistakably different from the person they once knew and mishandled. Not diminished by the past, but refined by it. More grounded, more internally stable, more fully expressed. A version of you where self-respect is no longer something intermittent or reactive, but something embodied, something consolidated, something that carries weight without needing to announce itself. And in that moment it no longer passes through the usual internal filters the avoidant relies on to soften emotional impact. It lands directly. Either way, when this evidence arrives, the reckoning begins, and it is not gentle. What follows is not poetic justice in the simplified sense, and not punishment in any external sense. It is a layered internal collapse of prior assumptions, an adjustment of perception that cannot be undone once it has occurred. The first layer is cognitive. The avoidant begins to see, with a clarity that was previously inaccessible, the actual value of what was present, not the reduced, manageable version of the memory that was previously stored to make loss tolerable, but the full resolution reality of what they were in contact with. You are no longer remembered through the lens of emotional defense. You are perceived more accurately, and that accuracy is destabilizing. Qualities that were previously minimized or taken for granted begin to reassert themselves in full significance. Your emotional depth, your consistency of care, the rare way you understood them without reducing them, the patience that was not passivity but sustained emotional strength, the capacity you had to remain present in the face of their inconsistency without mirroring it back in kind. These are no longer background traits. They become central features of memory. And alongside this clarity comes a second layer that is far more difficult to integrate. Responsibility. Not abstract acknowledgement, not intellectualized regret, but the direct recognition of behavioral reality as it actually occurred. The withdrawals, the silences, the inconsistencies, the moments where presence was required and distance was chosen instead. The repeated pattern of offering just enough connection to sustain emotional attachment, while withholding the stability required for it to deepen safely. And now, seen in full context, it is no longer fragmented or excusable. It forms a pattern, a continuous line of cause and effect that cannot be separated from its outcome. They begin to see not only what they did, but what you carried in response to it. The emotional endurance, the generosity of interpretation, The repeated attempts to make meaning out of inconsistency without losing depth of feeling in the process. And the recognition of that imbalance produces a psychological weight that is often experienced as shame, not the shallow discomfort of being wrong, but the deeper confrontation with having been the limiting factor in something that had real emotional value. Now, when I say the betrayal ruined their life, it is important to be precise about what that actually means. It does not refer to external collapse. It is not about visible destruction or dramatic consequence in the material world. Those outcomes are not necessary for something deeper to shift. What is altered is access. Specifically, access to a version of themselves that only existed in relation to you. There was a self that emerged in proximity to your presence, a more emotionally open, more regulated, more integrated version that was not fully dependent on avoidance-based defenses. A version that was being shaped, often quietly and without their conscious awareness, by the consistency and emotional reality you brought into the dynamic. That version was not independently self-sustaining in the way they assumed. It was relationally co-created. It required conditions they eventually participated in dismantling. And once those conditions are gone, that version does not continue in the same way. What remains is not emptiness but contraction, a return to a narrower emotional range, a more familiar internal structure, a life that appears functional on the surface but carries a subtle reduction in depth that becomes more noticeable over time. And this is where the long-term consequence settles in. The independence that once felt like control begins to feel like limitation. The emotional self-containment that once felt like strength begins to feel, in quieter moments, like disconnection. The identity built around not needing begins to carry the implicit awareness of what it costs to sustain that position. Not dramatically, not constantly, but persistently enough that it cannot be fully unexperienced once it has been seen. And that is the part that lingers. It becomes part of the background texture of their internal life, something subtle but persistent, quietly coloring everything that follows, even when they are no longer consciously thinking about it. Every later connection that fails to reach that same emotional depth carries it in the background. Every evening that feels slightly empty, even when nothing is technically wrong, carries it. Every moment of stillness where the mind briefly loosens its defenses and drifts toward reflection, only to pull itself back before it can fully land in the truth, carries it. Not as a single sharp thought, not as a memory that repeats itself in clear form, but as an atmosphere, a tonal shift in how life is experienced, like a change in lighting that you only notice after you've already been standing in it for too long. And there is something important to understand here about what betrayal actually does at a psychological level, because it does not only affect what is lost externally, it also influences what is constructed internally afterward. There is a principle in psychology that shows up consistently in both research and lived human behavior. We are shaped by the decisions we make at emotionally significant thresholds, not in an absolute, irreversible way. Human beings can and do change, but in a cumulative way that slowly becomes undeniable. Every time a person chooses the defended response over the open one, the defended response becomes easier to access next time. Every time withdrawal is chosen over presence in a moment where presence would require emotional courage, that pathway becomes more reinforced. Every time someone turns away from intimacy at the exact moment it asks for vulnerability, the internal architecture supporting avoidance becomes more established. And over time, this is not just behavioral, it becomes structural. The avoidant who betrayed you did not make that choice once. They made it repeatedly, in variations, across moments that mattered. Moments that looked small on the surface but carried emotional weight underneath. And each repetition strengthened the pattern that made the next repetition more likely. Not because they were consciously choosing destruction, but because they were gradually refining a way of being that prioritized emotional safety over emotional depth. What begins as a coping strategy eventually becomes a default operating system. So the betrayal does not simply end a relationship. It reshapes the person doing the betraying. It reinforces the walls. It strengthens the reflex to withdraw. It increases the distance between emotional reality and emotional expression. It makes certain forms of closeness feel slightly less accessible than they once were. Not dramatically, not visibly, but incrementally, in a way that accumulates quietly until it becomes the baseline. And now they are living inside the life those accumulated patterns have built. A life that may still function on the surface. In many cases, avoidant individuals remain highly functional in external terms. They can work, achieve, maintain structure, even succeed in ways that look impressive from the outside. But functionality is not the same as depth, and outward success does not erase the internal cost of the adaptations required to sustain emotional distance, because underneath that functionality exists a quieter layer of awareness, the knowledge of what was possible, what was present, and what was not fully honored, the awareness that something real was encountered and not fully met, that something meaningful was allowed to pass through without being fully received. And that awareness does not always present itself as regret. Often it shows up more subtly as a repeated sense of incompleteness that doesn't have a clear name attached to it, a quiet emotional residue that returns in moments when distraction fades and life becomes still enough to be felt. Now, it is important not to misunderstand this framing or turn it into emotional compensation. There is a natural pull in material like this toward psychological balancing, toward the idea that understanding someone else's consequences restores fairness to what you went through, toward the sense that if they were changed by it too, then the experience feels more complete. That feeling is understandable. When someone enters your emotional world and leaves without fully holding what they touched, the mind naturally searches for symmetry. It wants to know that the experience registered on both sides. But vindication is a fragile place to stop because it keeps your attention locked in the same direction as the wound, and what matters more, far more than whatever they are living with internally, is what has been forming within you in response to all of this. Because while they were managing avoidance, you were doing something fundamentally different. You were staying in contact with emotional reality instead of escaping it. You were processing what happened rather than bypassing it. You were allowing discomfort to be understood instead of fragmenting it. You were facing the experience directly instead of turning it into something easier to carry. And that does something to a person over time, not in a dramatic way, not as an immediate transformation, but in a structural one where the internal defaults begin to shift. You develop clarity where there was once ambiguity, self-respect where there was once negotiation, emotional precision where there was once confusion, and a more grounded understanding of what reciprocal love actually requires when it is not distorted by fear or inconsistency. The avoidant did not fully register what they were losing in the moment they were losing it. Their perception was filtered through defense, through distance, through the limitations of their own coping structure. But you were left with no such filter. You had to see it as it was, feel it as it was, understand it without the insulation they relied on to stay distant from their own emotional impact. And in that difference, something irreversible quietly forms. They lost access to a version of themselves that only existed in the presence of your emotional openness. But you did not lose yourself in the process. You carried yourself through it. You translated confusion into clarity. You turned instability into understanding. You took something that could have fractured your sense of trust, and instead used it to refine your sense of what is real and what is not. And what remains on your side is not an echo of what happened, but a developed internal standard, something more stable than emotion, more grounded than reaction, a sense of who you are when love is not fragmented, when presence is not conditional, and when your emotional reality does not need to be minimized in order to be accepted. That is the part that endures, and it does not belong to what they did. It belongs entirely to what you became in response to it. And in the end, what remains is not the rupture itself, but what survived it. Not the confusion, not the inconsistency, not the silence that once made you question your own perception, but the quiet clarity that slowly formed underneath all of it. Because experiences like this do not only take something from you, they also reveal something about you that was already there but had never been fully tested. Your capacity to stay aware when clarity is difficult, your ability to feel deeply without abandoning yourself, and your willingness to face emotional reality even when it would have been easier to detach. What happened may have started as something you had to endure, but it did not end as something that defines you. It became something you integrated. And integration is where power returns, not the loud kind, not the reactive kind, but the quiet kind that no longer depends on explanation, validation, or closure from anyone else. So what they left behind is not a void that needs to be filled, but an understanding that no longer needs to be questioned. You are no longer standing inside the uncertainty of what it meant. You are standing in the awareness of what it taught you, and that awareness does not pull you backward. It moves you forward, calmly, steadily, without needing to look back for confirmation that it mattered, because it did, and so did you.